Anne's suggestion, I have two letters for her to read. The first one is from Ted Yoon from Boston College, and he titled it, "In Thinking of the Legacy of Burton R. Clark." In the early 1970s, while I was a policy researcher in the federal government, I was introduced to Bob by James S. Coleman. Both Bob and Jim Coleman were members of the President's Commission on Youth in America. I was seriously considering furthering my education in the sociology of higher education. Bob was kind in encouraging me to think about pursuing a PhD degree in sociology at Yale. I arrived in New Haven in the mid-1970s, and my years with Bob as his research assistant and doctoral student in sociology were truly the best years of my life. I had a course in organizational theory on Wednesdays, a colloquium in higher education on Thursday, and stimulating conversations with Bob on Friday afternoons. A similar pattern of interactions repeated each year over the period of 7 years. In our Friday afternoon conversations, Bob would pose contemplative questions like, quote, "How were modern universities created? How would you describe or explain the social origins of American universities?" End quote. Another more quote. "How do you explain the theories of institutional impact of higher education on social structure itself and on the behavior of people throughout society?" In Bob's teaching, words such as institution, power, and legitimacy held special quality and profound meaning. Perhaps the most important legacy of Bob may be the understanding of higher education systems as institutions historically, comparatively, and structurally. Indeed, his carefully framed analysis of higher education systems has opened up a new way of examining formal organizations and cultural foundations. In this process, he brought much of historical and comparative analyses into sociological research. That is truly a unique contribution to social science research. He was a generous and kind teacher to all of us students. I will remember Bob with a deep sense of affection. The second letter is from Daniel Levy, a SUNY Distinguished Professor. I almost shudder to think what I have missed professionally if it had not been for Bob. In a path much more accidental than planned, Bob brought me to his Yale group, a, quote, benefits of disorder path. How lucky I've been to know Bob for 33 years. Bob's natural charm and ease always made me feel comfortable. He was kind, encouraging, and generous with me back when I was a kid, and then in my balding years. It was always, and I mean always, fun for me to spend time with Bob. New Haven, LA, conference sites, Bellagio, Lancaster, Santiago, and many more were always more fun and more interesting because Bob was there. By phone, in person, and through little notes, the Bob Clark style has always shone through for me. Free, Western, American spirit, wry, mildly and confidently self-deprecating, witty, light, insightful, optimistic, and much more. It was uncanny and almost miraculous how all this Bob Clark style could remain so evident on the phone, even in the final months and weeks. It would be presumptuous to elaborate on Bob's incredible and unique career, but for anyone in comparative higher education, it has been a towering reality and a great blessing. There's only one reason we cannot bid good night, sweet prince. Bob was a king, and I'm so happy he was blessed with a matching queen. Over the years, I came to realize more and more that the glory was Bob and Adele. Thank you. And next up, Patty Hubbard.
During the musical part, I was looking at Bob's photo, and it's just wonderful. I'm so glad that you selected this, and it's so fitting in the book. You know, the smile and the twinkle in his eyes, it's how I will always remember him. He was a gentle person, a gentle man, a gentleman as well, and yet a very powerful thinker and scholar. It's his love of the study of higher ed, like many of the others who've spoken, just ignited my own passion and really shaped my life's work. It was 25 years ago that I actually met Bob in print. My circumstances at the time is I was in graduate school at Stanford, and at that time we didn't have much in the way of faculty in higher education, so we used to call it do-it-yourself graduate school, relied on Pat McDonough and some others. What we found at the time was we had to go to the library. We would, you know, just scour the stacks and go everywhere we could, just looking for things to read, and we would share it with each other. And one day, it was in the Stanford bookstore. They didn't have much in the way of higher education, but on the bottom shelf, there was the book, The Higher Ed System. And it was 1983, as Roger said. And I sat down on the floor there, that bottom shelf. I picked up the book and I stayed there for a few hours. I was just so excited. It was amazing, and it was also this centrality of knowledge that really drew me in, and really has continued to spur questions for me throughout my intellectual life. That book, it turns out, was a constant companion for me throughout the years, and in fact, when I was sitting at my desk last night, there it was, right there, very dog-eared, the pages are yellowed. It reflects all the technology that changed over 25 years. I've got highlighted passages of different colors, and then post-its years later of different colors too. And it's just, it's a wonderful way to remember him as a constant companion, and it remains inspiring to me. I then met Bob in person in 1986. It was the conference, my first conference of the Association for the Study of Higher Education. Many of you were there. I was very shy. I remain very shy. I was finishing my PhD, and he had a postdoc opportunity on a study funded by the Spencer Foundation to study graduate education and research. And it ends up that I was selected for this postdoc, and I was amazed. And talk about an imposter syndrome. Coming from that higher ed program, to go to work with him, I felt like, uh-oh, remedial higher ed, I have to study, this is amazing. It's a 5-country study, excuse me, who does that? And then I do the US, that was my job. I thought, how is this gonna work? And over the next year, or actually 2 years, he was incredibly generous with his ideas, his books, his journals. You remember his office was filled with them. He just opened up everything to me, as well as his contacts, and it was over that time that I first met many of you. Just very generous as a mentor. And he remained that way over the next several decades. He was a confidant during difficult times. He always said the right thing. It was, and asked the right question. We spent some time together at conferences, often with Gary, eating ice cream. It always felt like the time was not enough, and yet at the same time it was sort of paradoxical because I felt like he was always with me. So he was always with me in my thoughts. As an almost perfect bookend to this meeting him in print, I said goodbye to him in print as well. First with the sociology of higher education, that was really, well, the volume was dedicated to him. Some of you here have chapters in that. It was amazing to me that his first article on that in 1973 was the first naming of the sociology of higher education in our field, and then this volume was the first one to use that title. And it was just thinking of Bob all the time when I was working on that volume. I put everything else aside, my other books and things. So I dedicated that to him, and then Adele and Bob asked me to write the foreword to the selected writings book, and it was just a tremendous honor to do that and to work with the folks at Hopkins to make that book happen. For those of us who knew him well, you know, he gave us great advice for our lives and advice for working in the field. I'll always remember, you know, he told us do field work, study comparatively, connect with practitioners, write vividly yet parsimoniously. We tried, but we never came to that standard. But I do feel extremely, extremely fortunate to have known him so well, not only as an intellectual, but as a mentor and friend. I am going to miss him a great deal. I intend to honor his legacy by continuing to pass this love of the study of higher ed on to future generations. I've done that in my teaching and research and writing. I feel like I'm doing that now in my administrative work. I haven't had a chance to talk with him about that, but I think he'd be proud. And as I go about my life now and with each day, I think of him and I think of the smile and the twinkle in his eye that's in that photograph. So thank you to everybody and Adele for bringing us together.
Although I had been aware of Bob's contributions to our field since the early 60s, I didn't get to know him personally until 1980, when I had the privilege of chairing the search committee for the first occupant of the Alan Carter Chair in our Graduate School of Education. This was our school's first endowed chair, and we were anxious to find a person with a distinction to fill it. And Bob fit the bill perfectly. I might add here that the connections that Bob had and our own colleagues were considerable. For example, the chair was established with a lot of good effort on the part of two people who were here, Maurice Salter and our dear friend Jill Carter. And it turned out when Alan got sick, he said, you know, you've got to find somebody else to do my work on the research projects that we were working with him on. And he recruited Vic Baldridge, who was a student of Bob's, who did his dissertation at NYU when Alan was the chancellor there. So there are all these connections that I think we should acknowledge. Both scholarly interests and inclinations were the ideal, Bob's scholarly interests and inclinations were the ideal complement to our higher education group at the time. He added a new focus on comparative and international education that enriched our group immensely. Bob was, of course, already well known in higher education circles in the U.S., but when I accompanied him to international conferences in Italy and Japan during the 1980s, I was amazed to witness the high esteem in which he was held by leading scholars in Europe and Asia. Whenever a difficult question was posed during these international sessions, it seemed that Bob was usually the person people would turn to for answers. Bob's impeccable scholarship, and much of it enhanced by the fine hand of our friend Adele here, won a well-deserved reputation as one of our top students of higher education. But his well-considered opinions and soft-spoken manner generated among his peers a high level of confidence in his judgment. Even after he retired, our chancellor frequently turned to Bob for advice and counsel. And while we can put a lot of labels on Bob that are quite accurate and appropriate: brilliant, literate, insightful, prolific. Over the 30 years that I knew Bob as a colleague at UCLA, one thing stands out for me as the key to understanding his professional life. He loved the life of a scholar, and he loved the subject matter of his scholarship, the higher education world.
First of all, I would like to convey the sentiments of a dear friend of all of us, and this is Guy Mead from Saint-Germain-en-Laye, who has written his tribute to Bob. Couldn't be here today, but he was wonderful because he was here several months ago, and he came to help out and stayed for a while, and I saw him there as well. With Bob, Guy edited the encyclopedia, and there are so many other networkings. You've heard some of that already. We're all so connected to one another over the years. In that most marvelous of all kinds of institutional creations, the invisible college. You can't see it, but it is very real. And anyhow, here is Guy, who sends us this. Bob Clark, the honest broker of higher education studies in Western Europe. There is no charge more demanding than to celebrate the work of a dear colleague and the passing of a good friend. Both his works and his life are deeply respected and deeply cherished. We endow them here with unblemished and abiding memory. Bob Clark's intellectual and scholarly rigor were equaled only by another quality. This quality is rare amongst the rare, his scholarly generosity. It was bold, it was limitless. It is most evident over the last 3 decades of his life as a scholar. It is celebrated most especially by those of us here who have come from the old world. For in truth, and none will gainsay it, Bob, like the Colossus of Rhodes, bestrode the Atlantic. In the words of one of Britain's most eloquent 19th century foreign ministers, George Canning, Bob called the new world into existence to adjust the balance of the old. He brought the clarity, incisiveness, and the unquenchable elan of American scholarship and perspectives from the old new world to spur on the adventure of higher education research in the old. It is the hallmark of a master among scholars that he furnished the domain of which he is master with new insights, concepts, even techniques. Without them, the field does not advance. Rather, it echoes emptily to the sound of busy routine, mechanically extended to its furthest nook and cranny. There is no need among such a company as this to mention the fundamental concepts and constructs Bob's work gave us. They are known to every student embarked on dissecting higher education. Let me suggest the way Bob shaped the study of higher education in Western Europe surpassed the coining of concepts and the hammering out of insights. It gave us in Europe a common vocabulary and a terminology all the more welcome precisely because it had application beyond the particular arrangements of Europe's individual nations. He gave us a tongue of exchange and a referential framework all the more welcome because partial to none. He was, and this I firmly believe, our indispensable honest broker, whose language opened a dialogue between the literally self-conscious, even narcissistic, and certainly self-regarding scholarly communities across the European nations. We now move on, more together than apart. That we can do so stands as much as a consequence, while at the same time being a tribute to the intellectual heritage Bob has given us. And we are proud to do so. To this, let me append a few words from me. At this point in the afternoon, so many wonderful things have been said. There's really nothing more original to say. I think all the great points have been made, but one says it in one's own way. So let me start this way by saying it was impossible not to love Bob. And Adele, let me say it's impossible not to love you. And I just wondered, it crossed my mind, strange things cross the minds of historians. You know, we're filled with all kinds of lumber of this or that, acquired through the ages. When you hopped in that car so many years ago, not knowing who this chap was, but he needed someone to help him drive across the United States, did you know what was going to happen? Did you know? Well, he couldn't, whatever it was, I guess a long car ride was the chemistry that was required to produce a remarkable pair. And I salute you, and I, of course, salute Bob. I was trying to, well, think of some kind of metaphor out of my own experience that captures a part of Bob. It's all inadequate, of course. But again, the strange things that pop into one's head. I was thinking of Jonathan Swift's 17th century parable, the Battle of the Books. And in it, there is interpolated this famous episode of the spider and the bee. The spider and the bee have a dialogue, really a dialogue over values. And the spider, from his web full of the dead flies and carcasses that he's acquired, they're puffed up with pride and toxicity from within his loins, says that he is a great builder and a great engineer, and he turns to the bee and he says, "And what are you?" And the bee says, "Well, you know, I flit around the beautiful gardens, and from thence I take a nectar from each of the flowers, and from the nectar I create honey and wax, that is to say, sweetness and light." This is the famous, of course, phrase that Matthew Arnold, the poet of the 19th century, will pick up. He talks about the need for sweetness and light. Bob gave us sweetness and light. I don't know why it was so calming to get a phone call from him. We had long conversations, and somehow I felt better after those phone calls. I thought myself, Bob was at Berkeley until 1966, and I arrived at Berkeley to teach in history in 1963. So we overlapped by 3 years, and I didn't know him. And I keep thinking, I might have amounted to something had I really known him. And he went off, and we met later on. He was part of a remarkable generation of people at Berkeley. Clark Kerr, who was president, Martin Crowe was then alive, Fred Walton was then alive, Neil Smeltzer came later. So I like to claim Bob for Berkeley. I know you have him at UCLA, and you had him longer, and I'm jealous, but we will say that Berkeley is there as well. Just a few other thoughts. One of the most remarkable things for me upon reading Bob is to say, where in the world did he get those ideas? How did he know how to organize this disparate mess of information in such a way and with such clarity, as has been said? I think that I'm pretty good at figuring out where people's thoughts first begin and the paradigms and conceptions that they've adopted and evolved. But he seems to me so startlingly original. I can't imagine how he did it, except that genius works that way. Of his books, I suppose my favorites, the one in Italy, I think you had something to do with that, Adele. The Italians, I think, still regard that as the best book on Italian higher education ever written. And then, of course, the one that's nearest to my own heart, in a way, the distinctive college, because I write on the history of liberal education. So we need some sort of quote. We did have a bit from Shakespeare a little bit earlier, didn't we? So let's have another one. Here was a man, whence comes such another.
I don't know about you all, but I feel like a bowl of ice cream. I want to pick up on the theme that several people have struck, which is the joy of Bob. For me, memorial services are and should be celebrations of life, and I think that's particularly appropriate in this case, given that Bob, really as much as any other man I've known in my life, had a tremendous capacity for enjoying life. It was always in his eyes, the gleam in his eyes that Lena and Patty referred to. A capacity for celebrating life. And celebrating the big and the small aspects of life. A bowl of ice cream, a book, just a tremendous capacity for joy, expressed for me most concretely and sort of quintessentially in his wonderful chuckle and laugh. My wife and I oftentimes find us, you know, how couples have little phrases from movies and the like that they replay again and again and again in certain situations. We replay again and again and again his chuckle. That's how I think of Bob, with a smile. I think the picture, as Patty said, is fabulous. It's so Bob. With the sound of his chuckle in my mind, as he would make some observation about academic life, about its foibles, about its follies, and oh, he had so many observations about academic life domestically, about academic life internationally. So many insightful and on-target observations that shape our understanding of academic life and academic organizations and academic systems. And his observations in his writings, as in his informal ruminations, were empathetic and affectionate. They were a celebration, as Sandy said, of the academic life that we loved so much, and the academic world that we loved so much. And so I think it is fitting that we celebrate his life with so much affection and love this afternoon. So much can be said about him, and as the cleanup person like Sheldon, I feel like, well, pretty much a lot has been said. There's not much more to say, but of course I'm an academic, so I do have some more to say about his life as a person and as a professor. And I guess what I would like to concentrate on in trying to capture something about this complex and powerful man is his unusual combination of three sets of traits. I'm the son of a Christian theologian, so I think in threes, forgive me. Bob was a proud and dignified man in the best senses of those words, and so he should have been. He had much to be proud of. The trajectory of his professional life from small-time clerk in New Jersey, as Ann started us out, to big-time international professor, department head, endowed chair in the finest public and private universities in the country, is the stuff of Horatio Alger type stories. And yet he had absolutely no arrogance in him. No sense of entitlement, no sense of self-importance. Instead, he was defined, for me anyway, by his sense of regard and appreciation. Regard for those who had taught him. I think it's great when a woman has books, because I can still hear him telling me what he had been taught in graduate school at Berkeley. Write books, they stand up on shelves by themselves. Regard for his contemporaries, like Sheldon and Guy, and so many others internationally who he brought together, and yet who he respected and had such regard for, and whose work he drew upon. An appreciation for his journey, his sense that it was a gift to be celebrated joyfully, which it was, just as Bob Clark's life and example are a gift to us to be celebrated. Second combination of traits starts with, on the one hand, his sense of possibilities in his academic work. Bob fashioned, as Roger described, a field of study. And he fashioned a variety of mechanisms, the use of postdocs. I was the first of the California postdocs. In fact, my interview in this building was in part to read a draft of his book, The Higher Education System, and give him some comments, which I think says something about him, that he was so engaged in and so devoted to his work, and so willing to take comment and input from anyone who was equally passionate and excited about what he was doing. His bringing together people in conferences that then led to volumes and creating associations. So he fashioned a field of study, he fashioned a variety of mechanisms that built and promulgated an entire field of study, comparative higher education, well ahead of his time, before sort of everyone was talking about globalization. At the same time, he never lost his sense of place, of proportionality, which is more than I can say for others that I have known who have established other fields of study in academia. He was level-headed about where he was, about who he was, about how his work was situated in the grand scheme of things, and though he shaped in quite profound ways the global framing of much comparative higher education work, he also had a very concrete sense, which several speakers have spoken to, of his contributions to organizational analysis, to local, concrete stories in a long and storied string of organizational scholars of which he was one. That combination of extraordinary scope of vision, of understanding national patterns and global patterns, and at the same time having an ear and an eye for the concrete, empirical, local realities that he captured in books like The Distinctive College, is central to what gives so much force and life to his work. Third combination of traits is, on the one hand, his seriousness of purpose, and on the other hand, his sense of the absurd and of joy. It's a testimony to his seriousness of purpose that he sustained his work over a span of 5 decades. Quite extraordinary. Such an extensive and powerful body of work speaks to the tenacity of his mind and spirit, to systematically apply his skills to so many types of settings and institutions. And at the same time, it's a testimony to Bob's sense of balance, that for all the seriousness and tenacity of his mind, he was also able to cultivate a sense of the silly, of the absurd, of the faculty meeting, which he said after he retired was one of the few things about academic life he really would not miss. He had a sense of the irony of academic life and the academic world. He not only did not take himself too seriously, he did not take the academic world too seriously. Like any insightful chronicler of the social world, he was attuned and sensitive to the paradoxes of the world, and he took pleasure in them. In closing, what I want to emphasize is that I speak not just for myself, but for my family. For my wife Janet and my 2 daughters Elizabeth and Olivia, who got to know both Adele and Bob. So I have all these fond memories of faculty club lunches, eating shrimp salad with Bob and hearing and talking about the work that we were doing, the work that he was doing. My older daughter graduated from UCLA, and Bob and Adele graciously would take her out to eat once a semester or so. So there's this sort of family connection, and I want to emphasize that I'm speaking not only of and to Bob, but also of and to Adele, like so many others who stood here. For so much, in my view, of what Bob was, so much of the gleam in his eye and the smile on his face and the joy in his heart are embedded in the relationship that he had with Adele. In my family, we speak not just of Bob, it's Bob and Adele. And we each have been the recipients of their graciousness. Bob was, as Patty said, a gracious man, a gentleman, in the best sense of the word, and a gentle man. A gentle spirit, a joyful man, an attentive man, able to attend as much to an academic as to a teenage young girl, as to a spouse who had no sort of experience or really interest in academic life, and yet he could be attentive to each of those folks and make them feel important and significant. And I think, as much, as highly as I think of Bob, I think a good portion of that also comes from Adele. He's someone who put everyone at their ease. Bob and Adele have touched so many lives, as is evident in this room, in such a positive, gentle, and loving way. And Bob's picture, I think, does capture it all. Before I came here, I was at my brother's house in Fullerton, and I showed him this picture, and I kind of said, because I'm like Dan Levy, balding, And my brother said, he's got such a happy, kind face. And I think that's also what I love about that picture. His picture really captures the essence of the man. He was an extraordinarily positive life force. To all who were blessed to know him. And that, I think, even more than his ideas, is the legacy